If you have ulcerative colitis or Crohn's disease and worried about getting bowel cancer, known as colorectal cancer, this video is for you. Colorectal cancer is one of the most feared complications of inflammatory bowel disease. But the good news is that there's a lot you can do to prevent this risk from happening in the first place. Hi, I'm Dr. Ryan Choi. I'm a gastroenterologist and inflammatory bowel disease specialist working in Sydney, Australia. In addition to that, I've completed a PhD specifically studying how inflammatory bowel disease leads to bowel cancer, and I've published scientific papers in this field, as well as the book chapter. In this video, I'll answer most common questions I hear from patients I see in the clinic, and at the end, I'll share an important strategy that you can implement today to minimize your cancer risk in the first place. So make sure you stick around until the end of this video. One of the most common questions I get asked all the time is, Doctor, why do I have such a high risk of developing bowel cancer? In my opinion, this is one of the most important and fundamental questions because once you understand why the cancer occurs in the inflammatory bowel disease, you'll begin to understand exactly what you can do to minimize the risk. Most of the stuff that I'll share in this presentation is largely based on my publication, which was published in Nature Reviews Gastroenterology and Hepatology, which is one of the well-respected journal in gastroenterology. If you guys are interested in reading further, please click on the link in the description below. To understand how things work, it is important to understand gut anatomy. Now, if you look at the picture on the right, you have the colon here. Let's imagine that we cut across the bowel. Then you get a picture in the middle here, where you will see that the colon is actually a hollow organ with a big hole in the middle. And if you look at the bowel wall under the microscope, you zoom into a small section here. If you look on the top of the picture, you get a finger-like projections denoted in the purple here. These are called colonic crypts, which are the basic units of the lining of the colon. So let's briefly review the normal crypt biology. So if you look at the top here, this is the lumen of the bowel where the things like bacteria and the food particles passes through. And because this causes a bit of a wear and tear, the cells on the surface or the crypt get shed and lost into the bowel lumen. So the next question is, how do we replace these lost cells? The answer is a stem cell. Stem cells are the ones denoted at the bottom here as circled in red, and these are capable of replicating and producing replacement cells. And that when they do reproduce and produce these new cells, these moves up like an escalator until they reach the top of the crypt, where they get lost into the lumen again by the process of shedding from the wear and tear. And this cycle continues every few days. Now, when the stem cells divide and replicate, its entire DNA gets copied to the new cell. And occasionally, during this process, an error can be generated while copying the DNA. And this is called a process called mutation, denoted by the lightning sign here. And you can see that this green stem cell becomes a red mutant stem cell. When the stem cell is mutated, its copies will also be mutated as well. What this means is that as the crypt gets replaced by the newly copied cells, which are all mutated, eventually the entire crypt will be populated by mutant cells carrying the exact same mutation. Mutation is not necessarily a bad thing. In fact, it is a vital biological process because each mutation gives a cell a new trait, which is a small change in how it functions. Most of these changes are completely harmless and sometimes are actually useful. We call this a selective advantage. This is a very important trait because your bowel needs to constantly adapt to a changing environment. As you can imagine, the food you eat, the medications you take, and degree of inflammation changes all the time. And according to that, it is important that your cells in the bowel wall adapt to these changes and continue to thrive rather than get destroyed. For example, if your diet becomes really deficient in vitamin B, cells with the mutation that have the increased ability to absorb vitamin B will continue to thrive, whereas those who don't will die off. So, in fact, gaining the mutation that confers the cells an ability to absorb vitamin B better will actually be a beneficial mutations. So by the process of natural selection, this cell continues to pass on its mutation to its progeny and continue to thrive, pass on their genes. So that's what normally happens, but let's have a look at what happens in inflammatory bowel disease. As with usual, stem cells at the base of the crypt may acquire a particular mutation, just like here. But this time, let's say the new mutation gives them a special power to thrive in a hostile inflammatory environment, which is exactly what you get in inflammatory bowel disease, right? For example, like an ability to withstand the inflammatory damage or able to divide very quickly to replace cells. So this is the cartoon demonstrating that illustration. So for example, during an acute inflammation, the lining of the bowel wall will get destroyed because of the continuous inflammatory damage. So as a result, many of the crypts will die off and you have this vacant area as denoted in these red zigzag lines. But you will see that the crypt full of mutant cells with special ability to withstand the inflammation will continue to survive. In addition to that, now you have this vacant empty space where the normal crypts used to be, but now it has no crypts. This is the bad thing because if you don't have the lining of the bowel wall, all the nasty bacteria and other chemicals can get in and can cause more damage. So, as you could imagine, the cells must be able to replicate quickly to patch up these empty vacant areas to prevent the further damage from happening. So now in this classic inflammatory bowel disease environment, which cell do you think are better at replacing this vacant space? You're exactly right. It's the mutant cells that have special ability to withstand the inflammation and divide quickly will dominate and replace this dead epithelial area. So as a result, during the recovery phase, the damaged areas are entirely replaced by the mutant cell population. And the normal cell, what we call wild type cells, can't compete as it doesn't have the ability to survive in a hostile inflamed environment. And also it cannot divide quick enough like the mutant cells after the damage. It's actually very similar to what happens in the natural selection throughout the Earth history. As you know, if you look at the picture on the left there, millions of years ago, the dinosaurs ruled the planet. They were huge and powerful and sat safely at the top of the food chain, of course. And mammals did exist at the time, but they were tiny and were not as strong as the dinosaur. Therefore, they had no real chance to compete with the dinosaurs. So, if you imagine the prehistoric mammals are exactly like the mutated crypts, like the red crypts shown in the picture there, it stays in its place without dominating because it struggles to grow against the normal crypts. Because in the normal circumstances, having the special ability to fight off the inflammation doesn't really give these cells any advantage, so they stay put. In the Earth, as we all know, that a massive meteorite struck the Earth and it wiped out the most of the dinosaurs and completely changed the environment. Suddenly, the world became really cold and dark and really, really short on the resources. In this new environment, the dinosaurs really struggled, and giant bodies needed a huge amount of food supply, but food became scarce, and therefore they struggled to eat, whereas tiny animals, on the other hand, needed very little to survive. They were quick and they could adapt more easily and take the advantage of the new conditions. So the creatures that once seemed weak, the mammals, suddenly had the selective advantage. And over the millions of years, they spread, multiplied, and eventually became the dominant species on the planet. Again, this is a lot like what happens in severe flare in inflammatory bowel disease. If you look at the low mid picture here again, huge inflammatory attack wipes out a lot of cells in the lining of the colon, and the mutant crypt, with the special ability to survive this attack and divide much quicker than the normal crypt, will expand their territories quickly, as the picture shown on the right, and eventually dominate the landscape just like the mammals did. It is interesting to see there are a lot of similarities here. Now let's zoom out a little bit and have a look at what's happening at the level of the bird eye. This is your bowel in the picture. The panel on the right shows you the color representing the burden or the amount of mutation. So when you're diagnosed and have inflammatory flare, this promotes the growth of mutant cells in the part of the bowel affected by inflammation, as denoted by this little purple patch here. But over the years, if your disease is well controlled and you have no significant flare, which is an ideal scenario, there's no real selective pressure to promote the growth of the mutant cells, as their special ability to withstand the inflammation and divide quickly doesn't really give them any survival advantage over the normal crypts in non-inflamed environment. So they stay where they are and nothing really happens over the years, just like the mammals wouldn't have prevailed if the environment of the Earth stayed the same as the prehistoric days. But now let's see what happens if you have poorly controlled colitis with multiple episodes of severe flares over the years. Firstly, as I described earlier, this will lead to an extensive expansion of the mutant population as the normal cells fail to survive, but the mutant ones are well adapted to survive the inflamed hostile environment. Importantly, some mutants will accumulate more mutations, will give them further superpower to thrive in inflamed environment. So if you look at the middle picture here, and some mutant population will continue to gain more mutation and become stronger. And these newer mutants will end up replacing the old one, as you can see in the light green picture here, replacing almost half of the bowel. And elsewhere in the colon, you will also get the separate population of extensive expansion of the mutant population, as denoted in this light blue, as well as the cyan color there. With continuous episode of inflammation, over time these mutants accumulate more and more mutation and become more advanced and powerful, and eventually it will stop listening to body's controlling mechanism and become invincible and start to invade other tissues. That's what cancer is. So we call this entire process, where there's a rapid expansion of the mutant population, called field cancerization, where the entire bowel is preconditioned to develop an ideal environment for developing abnormal growth, such as bowel cancer. So that is our current understanding of how colorectal cancer develops in inflammatory bowel disease. Hopefully it all makes sense. So in summary, we saw that a key driver for cancer development is the inflammation. And because it promotes the cells to acquire mutation that confers them a survival advantage in inflamed environment, these mutants thrive in inflammatory bowel disease colon and cause field cancerization and continued inflammation. They become more stronger and advanced, eventually become a cancerous growth. So how do we prevent the cancer in the first place? If you watched this video until now, hopefully you'll agree that controlling the inflammation is the single most important way to prevent the bowel cancer. And I'm sure right now you'll have many other questions like, what is my actual risk of bowel cancer specific to my case? And does inflammatory bowel disease medication increase my bowel cancer risk? And how often do I need to have colonoscopy to pick that up early? And most importantly, are there any other things that we can do to prevent my own bowel cancer risk? This is exactly what I'll cover in the next video. You don't want to miss this one. I really hope that this video has helped you in understanding how the cancer develops in inflammatory bowel disease. And thank you so much for listening.